The freight driver slowed his team when he saw her on the rail cut. She was on her knees between the ties, scraping coal crumbs into a tin pail with a hand rake, her coat too large and her breath coming in short white bursts. A child's cough had followed him on the wind from a cabin half a mile behind her, thin, wet, the kind that carries. He watched her stop scraping and stand. She walked past the brass fittings the salvagers were loading, past the twisted coupling rods, and put both hands flat against a dented iron cylinder sitting in the mud. She held them there, palms down, eyes closed, as if the dead metal were telling her something no one else could hear. The handle broke on the third swing. Della Rowley felt the crack travel up through her wrists before she heard it, a dry snap like a shin bone giving way, and the head of the splitting wedge kicked sideways into the frozen dirt. She stood over the cottonwood round with half a tool in her hands and no way to finish the job. 6 weeks since Emmett died, a team had bolted on the grade south of Broken Bow, dragged him in the wagon box 40 yards before the tongue snapped, and threw him into the cut bank. The freighter who found him said Emmett was still holding the lines. Della did not know what that was supposed to mean. Holding the lines had not kept him alive. It had not paid the 2 chattel notes he left behind. It had not stacked a single cord of wood against the winter bearing down on Custer County like a freight train with no brake. She looked at what she had. A 12 by 16-foot claim cabin with one thin wall facing north and no storm sash on the windows. A small iron box stove with warped seams along the firebox that glowed orange in places where orange should not glow. 1 milk cow. 2 hens. 1 and 3/4 cords of poor cottonwood, the kind that burned fast and hot and was gone before you remembered lighting it. $29 in a tin under the flour sack. And Nettie. 8 years old, thin-armed, watching from the doorway with a wool blanket pulled to her chin and a cough that had started the week her father went into the ground. The nearest wood seller wanted $4 a cord delivered. Della needed at least 6 cords to heat through the worst of winter. That was $24 for wood alone, and winter had not even begun to bite. The notes against the team and wagon came to $14 due before February. $29 minus 14 left 15. $15 bought 3 3/4 cords. She already had 1 3/4. 5.5 cords total. Half a cord short of surviving, and that assumed nothing else went wrong. No illness, no broken stove grate, no stretch of 50 below nights that ate fuel like fire ate paper. She could not leave. Abandoning the claim before final proof would forfeit the land, and the Homestead Act did not give second chances. She had no relatives west of Pennsylvania willing to take a widow with a sick child, and no money for passage east. The claim was the only thing of value Emmett had managed to finish, and even that was not finished. The roof leaked where the tar paper had torn, and the door hung on leather hinges that froze stiff every night. Winter was not a mood out here. Winter was arithmetic, and the numbers did not work. Orson Bell arrived on the 4th day after the handle broke, riding a mule that looked as tired of the prairie as Orson looked tired of delivering bad news. He was 56, thick through the chest, with hands that had installed more stoves than most men had seen. He ran the hardware store in the Dry Creek settlement and served as the unofficial authority on who would make it through a Nebraska winter and who would not. People listened to Orson not because he was kind, but because he was usually right. He tied the mule and walked Della's cabin without asking permission. He pressed a palm against the north wall and held it there for 10 seconds. He opened the stove door, looked at the warped seam, closed it. He checked the chimney. A single run of 6-inch pipe, barely 8 feet above the roof line. No cap, no cleanout. He counted the wood. He looked at the stove again. Della stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching him take inventory of every way her life was about to fail. A little box stove is honest if you feed it, Orson said. He did not look at her when he spoke. He was studying the north wall like it had personally offended him. Yours will go cold before dawn, and you have not got the wood to argue. I know what I have, Della said. Do you? He tapped the wall. One layer of board, no sod banking. Wind will push through this like it is not here. Your chimney is too short for reliable draft. You will get smoke rolling back every time the wind shifts north, which it does from November to March. The seam on that firebox is going to open wider. When it does, you will have live coals falling on a plank floor. I can patch the seam. With what? It was not a question. Orson pulled his collar up. I will tell you what men with teams do. They bank sod 3 feet high around the cabin walls. They haul 8 cords minimum. They build a second flue, or at least extend the first to 14 feet. And they sleep in shifts during northerlies so the fire never drops. That is what it takes with a good stove in a sound cabin. Yours is not a sound cabin, and you do not have a team, a hired hand, or credit at any store I know of. Della said nothing. Nettie coughed inside. Orson looked toward the sound, and something in his face shifted, not to sympathy, exactly, but to the discomfort of a man who could see a disaster forming and had no obligation to stop it. The town's men will sell you supplies, he said, but nobody is lending muscle without payment. That is not cruelty. That is November. He mounted his mule. At the edge of the yard, he turned back. If you have kin anywhere, write them now. Do not wait until the first hard freeze to discover you should have left. Della watched him ride toward the settlement road. The wind picked up and pushed grit against the tar paper. Inside, Nettie coughed again, deep, rattling, the kind that lived in the chest and would not leave without warmth and rest and food that Della was not sure she could provide. She picked up the broken handle, turned it over, and wondered whether Emmett had seen the team bolt or whether it had happened too fast to see anything at all. Then she put the handle down because wondering did not stack wood. She had 1 3/4 cords. She needed 6. She had $29 and 14 owed. She had a warped stove, a short chimney, a sick child, and a community that had already measured her for failure. How could anyone survive this? The question sat in the cabin like a fourth person, taking up space at the table, breathing the same thin air. 3 days later, Della walked to the rail cut south of town to collect coal crumbs. This was not a plan. This was scavenging. The Burlington and Missouri River Railroad had reached Broken Bow the previous year, and work cars still ran the new grade, dropping small black fragments of coal along the ties where the tenders were loaded carelessly. A bucket of coal crumbs burned hotter and longer than cottonwood, and nobody bothered to stop a widow from picking them out of the ballast gravel. It was beneath notice. It was beneath everything. Della did it anyway because beneath notice was better than frozen. She carried a tin pail and a hand rake, and she worked on her knees in the cold, scraping between the ties while the wind cut through her coat. Nettie was home with the cow and the blanket and a pot of broth that would be cold by the time Della returned. Every hour away from the cabin was an hour Nettie spent alone, and every hour at the cabin was an hour the fuel pile did not grow. There was no version of this arithmetic that balanced. The rail cut ran through a shallow grade where the ground dropped toward a creek. Near the bottom, Della saw men working. Not track crew, but salvagers. A service engine had derailed 3 weeks earlier on a soft rail joint, and the railroad had dragged the locomotive away but left the wreckage that was not worth hauling. 2 men with a wagon were pulling fittings, brass valves, coupling pins, anything that could be sold for scrap. And sitting in the mud beside the creek, dented and abandoned, was a cylindrical iron tank. Della stopped. The tank was 6 feet long, roughly 22 inches across and black with old soot. It had been part of the locomotive's auxiliary water system, a secondary boiler tank that fed the main works. Its fittings were cracked and useless. The railroad had left it because hauling 400 pounds of dead iron was not worth the labor when new tanks cost less than the freight bill for damaged ones. She set down her pail and walked to it. The two salvagers glanced at her and went back to their work. A widow with a coal bucket was not competition for brass fittings. Della put her hand on the iron. The metal was cold. Of course it was cold. It had been sitting in November air for weeks. But she kept her hand there, and something turned over in her memory. Her father, Abram Ketter, had worked the iron furnaces near Allentown, not as a smelter, as a repairman. He fixed kiln flues and patched furnace walls, and he spent his life around structures that held heat. When Della was 9, he had taken her into the cooling shed after a kiln firing and pressed her palm against the brick wall. The fire had been out for 6 hours. The brick was still warm enough to sting. Heat does not disappear when the flame dies, he had said. It hides in weight. The heavier the wall, the longer it holds. A brick wall gives back for hours what a fire gave it in minutes. She had filed that away the way children file everything, without knowing what it meant, without knowing she would ever need it. 29 years later, standing in a Nebraska rail cut with a tin pail of coal crumbs and a daughter coughing at home, the memory landed with the weight of the iron under her hand. Her stove burned wood. The heat rose. The chimney carried it out. The cabin cooled the moment the fire dropped. That was the cycle. Burn, heat, cool, burn again. Every cord of wood she fed the stove was a deposit she could never get back. The heat went up the pipe and into the Nebraska sky, and the sky did not need it. But what if the heat went through weight before it went up the pipe? The idea was not complicated. It was not even new. Her father had lived inside the principle every working day. If stove smoke passed through a mass of iron and stone, before reaching the chimney, the mass would absorb heat that would otherwise vanish. When the fire died, the mass would give that heat back slowly. Not forever, not enough to replace firewood entirely, but enough to stretch what she had, enough to turn 1 3/4 cords into something closer to 3, enough to buy time. She looked at the tank. 6 feet long, 22 inches across, 400 pounds of cast iron, dented but intact, with enough structural integrity to hold its shape. If she cut openings at each end, ran a stovepipe straight through the interior as an isolated flue, and packed the space around the pipe with river stones and dry sand, the entire assembly would become a heat bank. Fire the stove hard. Let the exhaust pass through the iron belly. The iron, the stones, and the sand would drink the heat. When the fire died, the mass would radiate for hours. The tank would never be sealed, never pressurized. It was not a boiler anymore. It was dead iron with a pipe through its gut and a belly full of stones. Simple, heavy, possibly lethal if she got the draft wrong. She thought about the stovepipe seam that already glowed orange. She thought about Nettie sleeping 12 feet from the stove. She thought about what Orson Bell would say. Then she thought about the arithmetic. 1 3/4 cords, $29, 14 owed. A chimney too short and a stove too small, and a winter that had not yet shown its teeth. She could not solve the problem by getting more fuel. Nobody was going to give her fuel. She could not solve it by leaving. The claim was all she had. She could only solve it by making the fuel she had do more work. And 400 pounds of iron was sitting in the mud, free for the hauling, because nobody else could see what it was. Della picked up her pail, collected the rest of the coal crumbs, and walked home. She did not touch the tank again that day. She needed to think about the design. She needed to think about the risks. And she needed to figure out how to move 400 pounds of iron 7 miles without a team, a wagon, or a single person willing to help. Lenora Pike came by 2 days later with a jar of milk and a face full of worry. Lenora was 41, a neighboring settler with 5 children, and a husband who worked a bigger claim to the west. She was not unkind. She was practical in the way that women on the plains had to be practical. She calculated risk the way Orson calculated stove capacity, and she had already decided that Della's situation was a tragedy she could not afford to share. "I heard you were down at the rail cut," Lenora said, setting the milk on the table. Her eyes moved around the cabin, the cracked saucer, the thin walls, Nettie's blanket fort near the stove. "Collecting coal crumbs," Della said, "and looking at that wrecked tank." News traveled fast in a settlement of 40 families. Della had not told anyone about the tank. She had not told anyone about the idea. But one of the salvagers must have mentioned it to someone, and someone had mentioned it to someone else. And now Lenora was standing in her cabin with milk and the expression of a woman who had come to talk someone out of something dangerous. "I am thinking about it," Della said. "Thinking about hauling a 400-pound iron cylinder into a cabin where your child sleeps. Thinking about running stovepipe through it, packing it with stone, using it to hold heat after the fire drops." Lenora sat down. She looked at the stove, the warped seam, the short chimney, the bucket of cottonwood splits that would not last the week. "If smoke cools in that iron belly," Lenora said slowly, "it falls back on you. Smoke goes up because it is hot. Make it cold and it sinks. If the pipe leaks at any joint inside that tank, you will not smell it until it is too late. Nettie will not wake." Della had already thought about this. She had thought about it for 2 days, turning the design over in her mind the way her father used to turn a broken flue coupling, looking for the cracks. The pipe runs straight through, no bends, no joints inside the tank. Clean entry, clean exit. The smoke never touches the stone, it stays in the pipe. The heat passes through the iron walls of the pipe into the mass around it. And if the pipe corrodes, if a seam opens inside where you cannot see it? "I build a clean out at the low end. I check the draft with a candle every time I fire. If the smoke does not pull, I do not sleep." Lenora shook her head. "You are talking about sleeping next to a thing that could kill you, and your answer is that you will stay awake. My answer is that freezing will kill us for certain. The pipe might kill us if I am careless. I would rather gamble on my care than bet on a winter that does not make bargains." Lenora left the milk and did not come back for 5 days. When Della saw her at the settlement store, Lenora looked away. Not from cruelty, but from the particular pain of watching someone you like do something you believe is a mistake. Della marked 3 failure points on the cabin wall in charcoal: bad draft, smoke, leak, floor fire. She stared at them while Nettie slept. If she could solve all 3, the design would work. If she missed any one of them, it would not matter how well she solved the other 2. The idea was not magic. It was not even clever, not really. It was just physics her father had shown her 29 years ago, applied to a problem that had no better answer. The risk was real. Lenora was right about every danger she named, but Lenora had 5 children, a husband, a bigger cabin, more wood, and a stove that did not glow orange at the seams. Lenora could afford to be cautious. Della could not. She decided she would move the tank. Cassian Rusk's freight shed sat at the crossroads of the settlement's 2 wagon tracks, which made it the closest thing Dry Creek had to a public square. Men gathered there to wait for mail, argue about the railroad, and pass judgment on their neighbors. Rusk himself was 49, wide-shouldered, and owned the 2 best wagons in the settlement. He sold cheap sheet iron stoves on credit at markups that would have embarrassed a Denver merchant. He also bought distressed improvements from homesteaders who failed their claims. A shed here, a fence there, always at prices that reflected the seller's desperation rather than the property's value. Rusk had already hinted twice that when Della failed, not if, when, he would take her improvements off her hands for a fair price. His definition of fair and Della's definition of fair would not have recognized each other on the street. Della stood outside the freight shed on a Tuesday morning and asked for help. She explained the plan simply. The tank at the rail cut was free salvage. She needed men with a team to drag it to her cabin, 7 miles. She could not pay in money, but she could offer labor, mending, sewing, hauling water, anything a person needed done. The men around Rusk's shed looked at each other the way men look at each other when they have already decided and are only working out who will say it first. Rusk said it. He leaned against the door frame with his arms folded and smiled the way a man smiles when someone has handed him exactly what he wanted. A widow hauling a boiler, he said, is like a sparrow dragging a plow. The laughter came easy, not cruel exactly. The way these men understood the world, it was simply funny. A woman alone, no team, no money, asking them to spend half a day dragging a wrecked locomotive part 7 miles so she could stuff it with rocks and pray it kept her warm. The image was absurd. The plan was absurd. And Della standing there in Emmett's old coat, with her jaw set and her hands raw from splitting wood. That was the most absurd part of all, because it meant she was serious. Rusk let the laughter settle, then made his offer. Sign over half your hay meadow. I will send 2 men and a team tomorrow. Della looked at him. The hay meadow was the only part of her claim worth anything beyond the house. Signing it over would halve the property's value and make final proof almost meaningless. Rusk knew that. The offer was not generosity. It was the first bite of a meal he intended to finish. No, Della said. No? Rusk raised his eyebrows. You have got $29, a sick child, and a stove that will quit on you before Christmas. I'm offering you warmth in exchange for grass. You are offering me a short winter in exchange for a lifetime claim. No. She turned and walked back toward the road. Behind her, the laughter resumed, but with an edge now. She had refused Rusk in front of his audience, and in a settlement this small, that was not just a business decision, it was a social one. The consequences arrived within the week. The storekeeper, C., who owed Rusk for freight hauling, cut off Della's nail credit. No nails meant no repairs to the cabin frame. A boy, maybe 11, followed Della from the well to her cabin singing Boiler, Widow, until Nettie came out and stared at him hard enough to make him stop. Lenora Pike stopped bringing milk. Her husband had told her that associating with Della was the same as endorsing a smoke death, and he did not want his name attached to it when the county recorded the cause. The isolation was not just social, it was material. Without nail credit, Della could not repair the north wall. Without milk, Nettie's broth was thinner. Without help from neighbors, every task took twice as long and cost twice the energy. But Della had already done the arithmetic. Rusk's help would cost her the meadow. The settlement's silence would cost her time and comfort. One of those losses was permanent. The other was not. She began preparing to move the tank alone. If you have ever been dismissed by people who could not see what you were building, tell us about it in the comments. Because what Della does next changes everything. She cut cottonwood rollers from fence posts, 6 inches across, bark stripped, as round as she could shape them with a drawn knife, borrowed from a neighbor who had not yet heard about the nail credit. She collected discarded rail spikes from the ballast, heavy, black, rusted, perfect for pinning a skid frame. She braided a hauling rope from 3 lengths of worn hemp that the salvagers had left at the rail cut. The first attempt failed before it started. She set 2 elm skids under the tank and tried to lever it onto the rollers with a fence rail. The tank shifted 2 inches, then the skid sank into soft ground and the rail slipped. The tank rocked back. Della reset the lever, tried again, and the rope she had tied to the front skid burned through her mittens and snapped against her palm hard enough to raise a welt. She sat in the mud beside the tank with her hand pressed against her coat and her breath coming in short, sharp pulls. The tank sat where it had always sat, 400 pounds of dead iron in a ditch, unmoved and unmovable by any single person working with rope and wood and stubbornness. Nettie was home. The stove was burning through cottonwood. The temperature would drop tonight, and Della was sitting in a rail ditch talking to a piece of scrap metal. She stood up, cut the broken lashing, and rebuilt the rig. She lost half a day and 1 good rope, but she did not leave. That was when Sjur Vangen saw her. He had been watching from the rim of the cut, 60 yards away, sitting on an upturned bucket outside his dugout with a clay pipe in his teeth and the particular stillness of a man who had learned patience from water and wind. Sjur was 64, Norwegian, former lake sailor out of Bergen, then a limekiln mason in Wisconsin before the grasshoppers drove him west. He lived alone in a dugout 2 miles from the rail cut because he preferred dirt walls to company and because his lungs were already beginning the slow collapse that would eventually kill him. He had watched Della fail. He had watched her sit in the mud. And he had watched her stand up, cut the rope, and start again. He did not see helplessness. He saw stubborn competence, the kind that breaks tools and loses skin but does not quit, the kind that needed direction more than rescue. Sjur walked down the grade with his pipe still lit. He did not introduce himself. He looked at the rig, looked at the skids, looked at the tank, and said, "Your purchase is wrong." Della stared at him. He was a stranger. He was old. He was telling her what she already knew. "The rope pulls at a low angle," Sjur said. He crouched and pointed at the lashing point. "All your force goes into the ground. You need height. You need parts." "Parts?" "Rope parts. In a tackle." He held up 2 fingers. 2 pulleys give you 2 parts of rope sharing the load. 3 pulleys, 3 parts. You pull 50 pounds instead of 200. Friction eats some, but some is better than all. Della knew what a pulley was. She had never heard anyone explain force distribution in terms of rope parts and shared load. Sjur spoke about it the way her father had spoken about heat, not as theory, but as a thing he had felt in his hands 10,000 times. "I do not have pulleys," Della said. "I have 2, ship blocks, old, but the sheaves turn." He looked at the tank. "This needs 3, 2 on the load, 1 on the anchor. We will find or make the 3rd. "Why would you help me?" Sjur relit his pipe. The wind tried to take the match and he cupped it without looking, a sailor's reflex. "Because you reset the rig instead of walking home. A person who resets a failed rig is a person who finishes work." He did not offer to haul the tank for her. He offered to set the first safe purchase, to teach her how to rig a system that multiplied her strength instead of wasting it. The difference mattered. He was not charity. He was a man who recognized competence and responded to it with instruction. Before they touched the iron again, Sjur made her dig. He showed her how to bury a dead man, a log set crosswise in a trench, 3 feet deep, packed with frozen earth, the anchor rope wrapped around it twice. Shallow stakes in frozen soil would pull free under load. A buried dead man held because the earth held it. "The ground does the work," Sjur said. "Not the rope, not you. You just asked the ground correctly." Della dug until her shoulders burned. Then she dug more. The dead man went in solid, 3 feet down, tamped with the flat of the shovel. Shore tested it by leaning his full weight on the rope. The log did not shift. They rigged the double tackle that afternoon. 2 ship blocks, old but sound, with hemp through the sheaves. Della pulled, and the tank moved. Not far, 8 inches, then a foot, then 2 feet. But it moved. 400 pounds of iron slid over frozen ground on cottonwood rollers because rope and pulleys had turned one woman's strength into something the iron could not ignore. The sun went down. Della had moved the tank 6 feet from where it had sat for 3 weeks, 6 feet out of 7 miles. At this rate, she would reach her cabin sometime in March, long after the cold had made the question academic. But 6 feet was not nothing. 6 feet was proof that the iron could move. And proof was the only currency Della had left. She walked home in the dark. Nettie was asleep near the stove, which had burned down to coals. Della fed it the last splits from the day's ration and lay on the floor with her coat over her legs and her hands throbbing and the taste of iron and cold air still on her tongue. Tomorrow she would go back. Shore would be there. The tank would move another 6 feet and then another, and the miles would shrink the way miles always shrink, not by wanting them shorter, but by walking them. The wind hit the north wall and pushed through like Orson said it would. Della pulled the coat higher and thought about 400 pounds of iron sitting in the mud, waiting. It was not enough. It might not work. Lenora was right about the smoke. Orson was right about the chimney. Rusk was right that she was a sparrow, but sparrows survived winters too. They just did it differently than anyone expected. The first week moved the tank 90 yards. Della worked every day from first light until her arms refused to pull. Shore came each morning with his pipe and his ship blocks, and the quiet patience of a man who had spent decades hauling weight across water and stone. He did not rush her. He did not do the work for her. He stood at the anchor point, watched the rope, and told her when the angle was wrong. "Lower your hands," he would say. "You're pulling up. The iron does not want to go up. It wants to go forward." She learned to read the rope. A rope under proper load hummed, a low, taut vibration she could feel through her mittens. A rope about to fail went slack in the middle, the fibers spreading apart like fingers opening. Twice she stopped pulling a half second before a strand parted. Shore nodded each time, but said nothing. Competence did not need applause. The physical cost wrote itself across her body. Palms split open along the lifelines and healed rough, the new skin thicker and less willing to bleed. Her right shoulder swelled where the rope had dug in during a bad pull when the tackle jammed. She skipped meals, not by choice, but because the walk to the rail, cut and back, took the hours she would have used to cook, and cold broth was faster than building a fire she could not afford to burn. Nettie walked beside the tank some afternoons, carrying the lantern when the light failed early, her small boots leaving tracks in the frost next to the deep ruts the skids carved into the ground. Progress had a rhythm. 3 pulls to move the tank 1 roller length, reset the rollers, reset the anchor. 3 more pulls. Each cycle advanced the iron 6 feet, and each cycle took 15 minutes when the ground cooperated and 30 when it did not. Frozen ground was hard, but predictable. Thawed ground was soft and treacherous. The skids sank, the rollers jammed with mud, and the tank settled into ruts that cost an hour to escape. The second week brought the creek crossing, and the creek nearly ended everything. The water was only shin deep, but the bank on the far side was a 4-foot rise of clay and frozen grass. Della tried to pull the tank up the bank on a straight line, and the tackle ripped the dead man out of the soft creek bank soil. The tank slid backward into the water. The splash soaked her legs to the knees, and the cold hit like a fist. Not gradual, not creeping, but instant and total, the kind of cold that made muscles lock and thoughts go white. Sure waded in and helped her drag the skids out. He did not say she had made a mistake. He showed her how to set a new dead man above the bank, 20 feet back from the edge, buried in solid ground instead of creek clay. Then he taught her something she had not considered. Do not pull the iron up the bank, Stewart said. Pull it along the bank. Find where the slope is gentle. A longer path on easy ground beats a short path on impossible ground. They walked the creek bank for half a mile before finding a place where the rise was gradual enough. The detour cost a full day. But the tank came up without fighting, and Della understood something about force that Shure had been teaching her all along without saying it directly. Strength was not about how hard you pulled. It was about where you stood when you pulled. The third week brought the hill below the cabin, and the hill brought Rusk. Della was resetting the tackle at the base of the slope when two boys appeared on the ridge. She recognized them, Harlan Watts, maybe 14, and the younger Rusk boy, Denny, 12. They stood watching for a while, hands in pockets, the way boys stand when they have been sent somewhere and are working out how to do what they were told without looking like they were doing it. Harlan walked down and circled the tank. Rusk said to check the salvage, he said. Wants to know if it is railroad property you're stealing. It is not railroad property. The fittings are cracked. The railroad left it. Rusk says different. Della pulled the receipt from her coat pocket, a scrap of paper she had forced a rail foreman to sign 3 weeks earlier, standing in the cold outside his work car while he complained about the interruption. The receipt read, 1 cracked auxiliary tank, no pressure rating, no salvage value, released to bearer. She had paid nothing for it, because it was worth nothing to anyone who did not know what she knew. Harlan looked at the receipt and shrugged. He did not care about the paper. He cared about being 14 and having been told to do a thing by a man who owned wagons. What happened next was quick. Denny walked behind the tank and kicked one of the rollers out from under the rear skid. The skid dropped. The tank lurched sideways and slid 2 feet down the slope into a shallow ditch. The rope went taut, then slack, then taut again as the whole rig shifted on the uneven ground. Oops, Denny said. Harlan laughed. They walked back up the ridge and disappeared toward the settlement. Della stood at the top of the ditch and looked at the tank. 3 weeks of work, 90 yards the first week, the creek crossing the second, the long pull to the hill the third. And now the iron was sitting in a ditch at an angle that would take a full day to correct, with the skids twisted and one roller cracked. She sat down on the frozen ground. The wind was coming from the north. It was the first week of December. She had been hauling this tank for 21 days, and she was still a quarter-mile from her cabin, and a 12-year-old boy had just undone a day's work with one kick. She thought about the $29, 13 now, after she had bought flour and a small sack of coal from a freighter passing through. She thought about Nettie's cough, which was better some mornings and worse every night. She thought about the box stove with its warped seam, burning through cottonwood like it had a grudge. She almost quit. The thought did not arrive as words. It arrived as a loosening, a feeling in her chest like a rope going slack, the fibers spreading, the tension leaving. She could walk away, leave the tank in the ditch, burn what wood she had, write to her mother's cousin in Harrisburg and beg for train fare, let Rusk buy the improvements, let the claim go back to the government, let someone else try to make this work. The loosening lasted about 10 seconds. Then Shure's voice came from behind her. Iron moves for patience before it moves for strength. He was standing at the top of the ridge with a pair of old ship blocks over his shoulder, different from the ones he had already lent her. larger. The sheaves were dark with old grease, and the shells were cracked at the edges, but the pins were sound. He had gone back to his dugout and dug them out of whatever box a sailor keeps his tools in, and he had carried them 2 miles because he had seen the boys on the road and known what they were sent to do. Della looked at him. He looked at the tank. Neither of them said anything about quitting. They re-rigged the tackle that afternoon with 3 blocks instead of 2. The mechanical advantage was better. 4 parts of rope sharing the load, which meant Della was pulling roughly 100 pounds instead of 200, minus friction. The tank came out of the ditch before sunset. The cracked roller was replaced with a green cottonwood log that Shure cut from the creek bank with a hand axe. That night, Della fed the stove and sat on the floor with Nettie asleep against her side. She looked at her hands. The split palms had healed and split again, and healed again, the skin layered like bark. Her shoulder ached where the rope had cut. Her boots were still damp from the creek, crossing a week ago, and had not fully dried because she could not afford the fire to dry them. She was going to move the tank. She did not know if the design would work. She did not know if the draft would pull, or the smoke would kill them, or the floor would catch fire. But she was going to move the tank because the alternative was the loosening, and she had decided that the loosening was worse than the hauling. The tank reached the cabin on the 22nd day. Getting it through the door became its own crisis. The door was 3 feet wide. The tank was 22 inches across but 6 feet long, and the cabin's interior was 12 by 16. The angle was impossible. The tank would not fit through the door on the skids because the skids were wider than the frame. Della removed part of the north wall. She pulled the boards from the studs, working with a claw hammer and the rail spikes she had collected, opening a gap 4 feet wide. Cold poured in like water. Nettie retreated to the far corner with every blanket in the cabin and watched with eyes that had stopped being scared of strange things her mother did and had settled into a kind of resigned curiosity. Jure braced a roof beam with a rope sling and rigged the tackle from the beam to the tank. The plan was to slide the tank over a plank bridge laid across the threshold, using the overhead tackle to control the angle and the rollers to carry the weight. The first pull cracked the beam. The sound was a deep wet snap, not the sharp crack of dry wood, but the slow failure of green timber, under a load it was never meant to carry. Nettie screamed. Shure dropped the rope and put his hands on the beam. Della felt the roof shift. Not much, maybe an inch, but enough to send dirt sifting down from the sod layer above. "Stop," Shure said. His voice was flat, not calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had heard rigging fail on open water and knew that the next 5 seconds mattered more than the next 5 hours. "Shore it, now." Della grabbed 2 cottonwood posts from the wood pile, thick, unsplit rounds she had been saving for fuel, and jammed them under the cracked beam. Shure guided them into position with his shoulder against the wood, taking the weight on his body while she hammered the posts tight with the flat of the axe. The beam held, the roof settled, dirt stopped falling. Shure stepped back and looked at the posts, the beam, the rope, the tank sitting half in and half out of the cabin wall like an animal caught mid-burrow. "2 more posts," he said, "1 each side, then we pull." They shored the beam until it could not move. Then they pulled the tank inside. It took 3 hours. The iron scraped across the plank bridge and onto the cabin floor with a sound like a ship grinding against a dock. Low, heavy, final. 400 pounds of dead locomotive iron sitting on the plank floor of a 12 by 16 homestead cabin, 7 miles from where it had been abandoned, moved by 1 woman, 1 old sailor, and a set of ropes that had no business carrying what they carried. Della rebuilt the wall that night. Nettie held the lantern. The cold that had poured in for 3 hours retreated behind fresh boards and tar paper, and the stove fought the remaining chill until the cabin was bearable again. The tank sat in the center of the floor like a body laid out for viewing, black, dented, enormous relative to the room. It took up a quarter of the living space. It smelled like old iron and creek mud. Nettie looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at her mother. "Does it work?" she asked. "Not yet," Della said, "but it will." She did not know that. She hoped it. And hope, out here, was a resource as finite as firewood. Construction of the heat bank took 5 days. Shearer returned each morning and stayed until the light failed. They worked inside the cabin, which meant working around Nettie, the stove, the cow's feed bucket, and the accumulated machinery of a life lived in 200 square feet. The air smelled like iron filings, wood smoke, and the particular dusty sweetness of river sand. Day 1. The plinth. Della and Shearer built a low platform from field stone, clay, wood ash, and broken brick. The stones came from the creek bed, flat, heavy, scrubbed clean of mud. The clay came from the bank. The ash came from the stove. They mixed it wet, packed it into a rectangular form the length of the tank, and let it set overnight near the stove's heat. The plinth raised the tank 8 inches off the plank floor. 8 inches of stone and clay between 400 pounds of iron and dry wood. Not much. Enough to make the difference between a heat bank and a house fire. Day 2. The collars. Della riveted stovepipe collars to each end of the tank using iron straps she had hammered flat from rail spikes. The collars were rough, not the machined fittings of a proper stove installation, but hand-shaped iron pounded and bent until it gripped the pipe. The entry collar at the stove end accepted 6-inch pipe from the stove's rear exhaust. The exit collar at the chimney end fed into a taller chimney run that Shearer insisted on, 14 feet minimum above the roof line instead of the 8 Della had before. "Height makes draft," Shearer said, fitting pipe sections together with his sailor's hands, each joint seated and crimped with a precision that came from years of fitting mast hardware in weather. A short chimney begs the wind to push smoke back down. A tall chimney pulls. The fire does not care about your intentions. It cares about physics. Day 3. The packing. Della filled the tank's interior, the space between the outer shell and the stovepipe running through the center, with washed river stones and dry sand. The stones were rounded, fist-sized, heated first near the stove to drive out moisture. Wet stones in a heat bank could crack when they expanded, sending fragments through the iron shell or blocking the air gaps that let heat circulate. Dry stones absorbed heat evenly and gave it back slowly. She packed them tight, tamping with a stick, layering sand between the stones to fill gaps. The sand served 2 purposes. It increased the total mass, and it conducted heat from the iron pipe walls to the stones that were not in direct contact. Every pound of mass was a pound of heat storage. By the time the tank was full, it held roughly 300 pounds of stone and sand on top of the 400 pounds of iron. 700 pounds of thermal mass, sitting on a clay plinth with a stovepipe running through its heart like a vein. Day 4. The bypass damper and clean-out. Shearer insisted on both. The bypass damper was a hinged plate at the entry collar that could redirect stove exhaust straight up the chimney, skipping the tank entirely. This was critical for starting the stove. Cold iron and cold stones would kill the draft if smoke hit them before the chimney was warm. Open the bypass, let the chimney heat, let the draft establish, then close the bypass and route the exhaust through the tank. The clean-out was a square iron plate bolted to the low end of the tank, removable for scraping soot and checking the internal pipe for corrosion. Lenora's warning lived in that clean-out. If the pipe deteriorated inside the tank, smoke would leak into the stone packing and seep into the cabin through every gap in the shell. The clean-out let Della inspect the pipe without dismantling the entire system. Day 5. The test. Della loaded the stove with one armload of cottonwood, about 15 pounds of wood, enough for 90 minutes of hard burning. She opened the bypass damper, lit the fire, and waited. The chimney warmed. The draft pulled. Smoke streamed upward through the tall pipe, clean and steady. Shore held a candle near the bypass plate and watched the flame bend toward the chimney, proof the air was moving in the right direction. She closed the bypass. Smoke now traveled from the stove through the 6-inch pipe inside the tank, heating the iron walls, which heated the stones and sand packed around them before exiting into the chimney. The tank began to tick, small metallic sounds as the iron expanded under heat. Then it began to groan, deeper, a bass note that vibrated through the plinth and into the floor. Nettie pressed her back against the far wall and stared. The stove burned for 90 minutes. Della let it die. The fire went out. The stove went cold. The cabin should have started losing heat immediately. That was the normal cycle, the one she had lived through every night since Emmett died. Fire dies, cabin cools, wake up freezing, start again. But the tank was radiating. 3 hours after the fire died, Della put her hand on the iron shell and pulled it back, too warm to hold. The stones inside were giving up the heat they had absorbed, passing it through the iron to the air. The cabin temperature, which should have been dropping toward freezing, sat at 46 degrees. By dawn, 8 hours after the fire went out, the cabin was still 46 degrees. Not warm, not comfortable, but 46 degrees was the difference between a child sleeping through the night and a child shivering awake at 3 in the morning. It was the difference between 1 firing and 2. It was the difference between 1 3/4 chords lasting until January and lasting until February. It was not triumph. The chimney wept black creosote at one joint where the tall pipe met the original run, proof that the exhaust was cooling too much before it exited, condensing tar on the pipe walls. Lenora's fear was partly right. If the creosote built up, it would restrict the pipe, slow the draft, and eventually send smoke backward into the cabin. Della scraped the joint clean and resealed it with clay, stove cement, and iron wire. The seal held, but it was ugly, a thick collar of gray paste that would crack if the pipe expanded too fast. Orson Bell came the next afternoon. He did not say who told him. He walked into the cabin, looked at the tank, and stood still for a long time. He crouched and checked the clean-out plate. He tapped the chimney run and listened to the sound. He held a candle at the entry collar and watched the flame. "The draft is marginal," he said. His voice had lost the certainty it carried the first time he stood in this cabin. He was not dismissing. He was assessing, and what he was assessing did not fit his categories. "You have slowed the exhaust through 6 feet of iron. The chimney is tall enough to compensate, but barely. If the wind shifts hard north and pushes down the pipe, you will lose the draw." "I have the bypass," Della said. "If the draw fails, I open it and the smoke goes straight up." "And if you are asleep when the draw fails?" "I check the candle before I sleep. If the flame bends wrong, I open the bypass and bank the fire." Orson stood up. He looked at the tank, at the plinth, at the chimney, at the stove with its warped seam. He looked at Della. "It may warm you," he said. "It may poison you. Those are not opposites." He left. Della watched him go and felt the truth of what he said settle into her chest beside the fear that had lived there since Emmett died. The machine worked. The machine was also dangerous. Both things were true, and she was going to sleep next to it anyway, because the alternative was the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had not changed. She sealed the creosote joint again. She checked every collar, every pipe section, every bolt on the clean-out. She built a small test fire and watched the candle flame at the entry collar for an hour, tracking the draft through 3 wind shifts. The flame bent toward the chimney every time. The draw held. Schur came that evening and insisted on one more rule. No sleeping until the smoke candle pulls steady for 30 minutes. Every night. No exceptions. If you are too tired to watch the candle, you are too tired to trust the fire. Della agreed. It was not a hard promise. She had not slept well since Emmett died. Another 30 minutes of watching a candle flame was nothing compared to the hours she spent staring at the ceiling, listening to the stove tick and the wind test the north wall, and Nettie breathe. The tank sat on its plinth and radiated. The cabin held its warmth like a fist holding a coal. Outside, December pressed against the walls, and the sky to the northwest was the color of a bruise that had not yet decided how bad it was going to be. The storm they would call the Black Frost began like mercy. January 12 dawned soft. Snow melted from fence rails. Ice loosened its grip on the well rope. Children walked the mile to the Dry Creek schoolhouse with coats unbuttoned, and the women who watched them go said it felt like March had come early, like the winter had spent itself and was ready to relent. It had not spent itself. It was loading. By mid-afternoon, the northwest horizon turned black. Not gray, not the soft charcoal of coming snow. Black, a wall of dark air that stretched from the ground to the top of the sky, as if the prairie itself had stood up and started walking south. The temperature, which had reached 34 degrees at noon, began to fall. It did not fall slowly. It dropped the way a stone drops, straight down, accelerating, with nothing to slow it. Rain came first, thin, hard needles of water that hit the ground and froze on contact. The grass became glass. The fence wires became glass. The well rope became a rigid column of ice that would not coil. Then the rain turned to snow, but not the kind that drifted down in fat flakes. This was horizontal, driven by a wind that came from the north. Like a thing with weight and intent, the snow traveled sideways, packing into every gap, every crack, every seam in every wall in the settlement. Visibility dropped to nothing. A person could not see their own hand at arm's length. Della was hauling water from the well when the wall hit. She saw it coming, the black edge, the trees bending before it like grass, the sudden silence as every bird in the creek bottom went quiet at the same instant, and she dropped the bucket and ran for the cabin. She fired the stove harder than she had ever fired it. Cottonwood, coal crumbs from her dwindling bucket, 3 split chair rungs from a broken seat she had been saving for emergency fuel. She opened the bypass, let the chimney roar, felt the draft pull strong and steady, then closed the bypass and sent the heat into the iron belly. The tank began to tick. Then it groaned. The deep bass note vibrated through the plinth, through the floor, through Della's boots, and up into her legs. 700 pounds of iron and stone waking up, drinking heat, preparing to hold it. The temperature outside dropped through 20 degrees, through 10, through 0. The wind found every weakness in the cabin, the north wall, the door hinges, the tar paper seam above the window. Cold came through in thin blades that cut the warm air near the stove and dissolved it. Schur arrived at dusk. He came through the door with frost on his beard and his coat stiff with ice, and he stood by the stove without speaking for a full minute. His face was red where the wind had hit it, and white where the cold had bitten deeper. He had walked 2 miles in a storm that could not be walked in, and Della did not ask why because she already knew. The test had arrived. He had come to see whether the thing they built would hold. "The damper," he said. His voice was rough. Keep it half open until the chimney draws full. If you close it too tight, the exhaust will slow and the creosote will build faster than you can clear it. Della adjusted the damper. The draft steadied. The chimney hummed. Then Nettie's fever came back. It started as flushed cheeks and glassy eyes, the kind of thing that could be a warm room or could be something worse. Within an hour, it was something worse. Nettie's forehead burned under Della's hand. The cough returned, deep and wet, the kind that bent her small body double and left her gasping. She could not be moved to the loft. She could not be moved at all. Della laid her on the pallet near the tank, where the radiant heat was strongest, and covered her with every piece of cloth in the cabin. The stove ate fuel. Della fed it and calculated. She had started the day with 1 quart of cottonwood and a 1/4 bucket of coal crumbs. At this burn rate, hard, continuous, fighting a wind that stole heat faster than the stove could make it, she would be out of wood by tomorrow afternoon. The tank would hold heat after the fire died. But for how long? And in a storm this bad, with the wind this strong, with the cabin this thin, would the stored heat be enough? She fed the stove another armload and watched the temperature on the glass thermometer sure had hung from a nail. 68 degrees near the tank, 42 degrees at the north wall, a 26-degree spread inside a single room. The tank was working. The cabin was not. The weak wall, the short original chimney run, the gaps in the tar paper, every flaw Orson had catalogued was now an open door for the cold. Then the stove pipe seam glowed, the warped seam along the firebox, the one that had glowed orange since before Emmett died, turned dull red under the hard firing. Della saw it and felt her stomach drop. A red seam meant the iron was approaching failure. If the seam opened, live coals would fall onto the plank floor. In a cabin with a sick child, a 700-pound immovable heat bank, and a storm that made evacuation impossible, a floor fire was not a problem. It was the end. She cut the fire, pulled the burning wood out of the firebox with the iron tongs, and drowned it in the water bucket. Steam erupted. Nettie flinched. Sure moved the pallet farther from the stove. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the next few hours inside this cabin changes everything. The stove went dark. The cabin began to cool. And now the only heat source was the iron tank, charged with whatever it had absorbed over the past 3 hours of hard firing. 3 hours, not the 6 or 8 she had planned, not the slow, full charge that would have saturated the stones and sand to their cores. A half charge, maybe a third. She put her hand on the tank. Warm, not the searing heat of a fully loaded mass, but warm, the kind of warmth that said the iron had taken what it could in the time it had. The question was whether it was enough. At 9 o'clock, someone knocked on the door. Della opened it to find Lenora Pike's youngest boy, Caleb, 9 years old, standing in the dark with his coat frozen stiff and his left ear white with frostbite. He was shaking so hard he could not speak for the first 30 seconds. When the words came, they came in pieces. Their stovepipe had blown loose. The joint where the pipe met the chimney thimble had separated in the wind, and smoke had filled the house. Lenora's husband had climbed onto the roof to reattach it, and the ice had taken his feet out from under him. He was alive, but on the ground with a twisted ankle, unable to climb, and the pipe was still loose. The house was filling with smoke and cold simultaneously. Lenora had sent Caleb to the nearest light, which was Della's window. Della looked at Shure. Shure looked at the tank, at Nettie on the pallet, at the thermometer reading 61 degrees and dropping. Every person who came through the door would bring the storm in with them. Every opening of the door would steal heat that the tank could not replace because the stove was cold. Every body was warmth, A human being generated heat, but every body was also need. More need than the tank had been built to serve. How many? Della asked. Caleb held up one hand, fingers spread. 5, Lenora, her husband, and 3 remaining children. Della did not look at Shure again. She pulled Caleb inside, wrapped him in Emmett's old coat, and said, "Bring them." Caleb ran. The door closed. The thermometer dropped to 59. Within the hour, the cabin held 9 people. Lenora arrived carrying her youngest, a girl of 3, and dragging her husband by the arm. 2 more children followed, the oldest holding the youngest hand. They piled into the cabin and pressed against the tank and the walls and each other, and the room that had been small for 2 people became a compression of breath and fear and the sharp smell of frozen wool thawing. Mace Teague arrived next, an old bachelor from the dugout south of the creek, found by Lenora's oldest boy stumbling in the dark, alive but confused and half frozen. He could not form sentences. Della sat him beside the tank and wrapped his hands in cloth. The fire stayed dead. The warped seam on the stove was a line Della would not cross. Not with 9 people, not with a plank floor, not with a child on a pallet. The only heat was the iron. For the first hour after midnight, no one spoke. The storm screamed outside like something alive and furious. The cabin walls flexed. Snow drove through the tar paper seam in a fine white mist that settled on everything. The temperature inside dropped through 55, 52, 50. Then it held. The tank radiated, not fiercely, not the way a stove radiated, throwing heat in waves that burned the skin. The tank gave up its warmth the way a stone wall gives up sunlight at the end of a long day. Slowly, steadily, without urgency. The iron shell was warm to the touch. The stones inside, packed tight in their bed of sand, released heat through the metal into the air, and the air, trapped by the bodies and the walls and the blankets hung over the windows, held it. People crowded close, palms outward, faces turned toward the iron, the way people face a fire. But there was no fire. There was only weight, 400 pounds of iron and 300 pounds of stone, doing what Della's father had told her heavy things did, holding heat after the flame died and giving it back when the world went cold. The thermometer settled at 51 degrees and did not drop further. 51 degrees was not warm. No one would call 51 degrees comfortable. But 51 degrees in a cabin with a wall that leaked and a stove that was dark and a storm outside that was killing livestock in the open was the difference between waking up in the morning and not waking up at all. Nettie's fever broke near 3 in the morning. Della felt it happen, the forehead cooling under her palm, the breathing easing, the small body relaxing from the rigid curl of illness into the loose sprawl of ordinary sleep. She did not cry. She held her daughter's hand and listened to the tank tick, slow, metallic, the sound of iron contracting as it gave away its heat 1 degree at a time. Shure collapsed before dawn. The walk, the 2 miles through the storm, the cold that had bitten his face and his lungs, the hours in a cabin that was warm enough to live in, but not warm enough to heal. He went down silently, one moment standing by the wall, the next on his knees, then on his side, his breath coming in shallow rasps that sounded like paper tearing. Della and Lenora moved him to the pallet. His face was gray. His hands were cold despite the hours inside. His lungs, already weakened by decades of lime dust and lake wind, had taken the storm walk like a blow they could not absorb. He survived the night. But something in him did not come back, a depth in his breathing, a steadiness in his hands, a color in his face, gone, as if the storm had extracted payment for the 2 miles he had walked to see whether the iron would hold. Morning came slow and gray. The storm eased from a scream to a moan to a whisper. Della opened the door to a world coated in ice. Every surface, every fence wire, every blade of grass sheathed in clear crystal that caught the low sun and turned the prairie into something that looked like beauty, but was made entirely of damage. Orson Bell arrived at mid-morning. He had frostbitten fingers on both hands, the tips black, the skin cracked. He had spent the night feeding his own stove every 45 minutes, and even so, ice had formed on the inside of his windows. He came not to apologize and not to congratulate. He came because he had heard that people were alive inside Della's cabin, and he needed to understand why. He stepped inside. He saw 9 people. He saw the cold stove. He saw the tank on its plinth, still faintly warm to the touch, 16 hours after the last fire had been killed. He saw Nettie sleeping on the pallet, her fever broken. He saw Shure on the floor, breathing shallow, alive because the iron had held. Orson removed his hat. He stood beside the tank for a long time. He did not say anything. Then he put his ruined hands against the iron, palms flat, the way a person puts their hands on a thing they are trying to believe. The contrast told the story before anyone spoke a word. Della's windows were wet inside. Condensation, not frost. A kettle sitting near the tank held water that was still warm to the touch. Across the settlement, stovepipes were bent where the wind had pushed them sideways. Water pails were frozen solid in kitchens where fires had burned all night. Families sat in their cabins with blankets over their heads, and ash on the floor, and the particular gray exhaustion of people who had spent 12 hours feeding a fire that could not keep up with the cold. Orson Bell did not leave Della's cabin for 3 hours. He circled the tank the way he had circled her cabin that first day in November, pressing his hands against surfaces, checking joints, studying connections. But the expression on his face was different now. In November, he had been cataloging failure. In January, he was cataloging something he did not have a category for. He crouched at the clean-out plate and removed it, peered inside with a candle. The internal pipe was coated with creosote, but intact. No cracks, no separation at the collar joints. The stones were dark with conducted heat, but held their shape. Sand filled every gap. The system was crude, ugly, improvised from scrap, and it had kept 9 people alive through the worst night Custer County had seen in a decade. Orson replaced the clean-out plate and stood up. Lenora was watching him from the corner where she sat with her children. Shure lay on the pallet, breathing in short, shallow pulls. Mace Teague had regained speech, but not color. Nettie was eating broth. I judged it like a stove, Orson said. His voice carried the flat precision of a man who was not apologizing but correcting an error in his own calculations. It is not a stove. It is a bank. You fire it, and it holds the deposit. The deposit earns interest while you sleep. He looked at Della. I told you it might warm you or poison you. It warmed 9 people with a dead fire. I was wrong about the ratio. It was not a warm speech. It was not meant to be. Orson dealt in assessments, and he had just revised his. The men standing behind him, 2 neighbors who had followed him in to see the spectacle, heard it, and the weight of Orson Bell being wrong about a stove traveled through the settlement faster than the storm had. Lenora's conversion was quieter and cut deeper. She waited until the others had left. Her husband had gone home to repair their stovepipe with 2 borrowed sections from Orson's hardware stock. The children had been bundled out. Shure was sleeping. Only Della and Lenora remained, and between them sat the tank and the silence of 2 women who had been on opposite sides of a question that was no longer a question. I stopped bringing milk, Lenora said. She did not look at the tank. She looked at Della's hands, the split palms, the rope scars, the nails blackened from iron and clay. Hjalmar said I should not encourage a smoke death. I listened because it was easier than arguing. Hjalmar was not entirely wrong, Della said. The smoke risk was real. It is still real. But you managed it. I watch a candle every night. I scrape the joints every week. I check the clean out every third day. The risk does not go away. I just know where it is. Lenora reached into her coat and brought out a tin of stove polish, the kind used to seal and protect iron surfaces, expensive enough that frontier families saved it for their best stove. She set it on the table beside the cracked saucer that had been there since November. For the tank, Lenora said. It will keep the rust from eating the shell. Della picked up the tin. It was warm from Lenora's coat. She did not say thank you because the moment did not need words. Two women understood what the tin meant, and that was enough. Within the week, people came to Della's cabin to look, not to ask permission, not to schedule a visit. They simply appeared. A man at the door with his hat in his hands, a woman with a child on her hip, a pair of brothers who farmed the section east of the creek. They stood inside the 12 by 16-foot room and stared at the iron tank on its stone plinth and tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Della gave measurements. 6-inch pipe minimum from stove to tank. 14-foot chimney, no less, or the draft would fail under north wind. Stone plinth at least 8 inches thick. Field stone, clay, ash, broken brick, whatever was heavy and would not burn. Clean-out plate at the low end, removable, checked every third day. Bypass damper at the entry collar for starting the fire. Never sealed. Never pressurized. The tank was not a boiler. The moment someone treated it like a boiler, they would die. She repeated the danger as often as she repeated the design. Every person who stood in her cabin heard the same words. This works because I watch it. If you build one and stop watching, it will kill you. Heat does not forgive carelessness. Neither does smoke. Not everyone wanted a tank. Most could not have hauled one even if tanks were available, which they were not. The railroad wreck had yielded exactly one, and it was sitting on Della's floor. But the principle was transferable. Heat stored in mass. Mass could be anything heavy: stone, brick, clay, sand, iron. A pile of flat stones stacked around a stove absorbed heat during firing and released it after the fire dropped. A longer stovepipe run, 12 feet instead of 6, routed through a mud-packed bench along the wall instead of straight up through the roof, did the same thing at smaller scale. The method spread first as small modifications. A farmer named Rolf Haugen stacked river stones 3 deep around his box stove, floor to waist height, with an air gap at the base. His cabin held heat 2 hours longer after the fire died. He came back to Della's cabin and reported the numbers like a man delivering proof of something he had not expected to prove. A woman named Marte Espeland built a bench along her south wall, a wooden frame packed with clay and sand, with her stovepipe running through it horizontally before turning up to the chimney. The bench was warm enough to sit on 4 hours after the fire went out. Her children fought over who got to sleep beside it. Della taught on Sundays. She pushed the table against the wall, set 2 chairs near the tank, and walked people through the principles with a candle, a strip of cloth, and the clean-out plate. She showed them how smoke moved, how draft worked, how heat transferred from fire to iron to stone to air. She showed them the creosote joint and the stove polish and the bypass damper. She showed them what failure looked like. The black soot rope in a blocked pipe, the dead candle flame that meant no draw, the condensation on cold iron that meant the mass was saturated and could hold no more. The first person to arrive for Sunday teaching was Lenora Pike. She brought stove polish and a loaf of bread, and a list of questions that proved she had been thinking about heat storage since the night she huddled against the tank with her 3 children. Her questions were sharp. How thick should the clay be between the pipe and the stones? What happens if the stones are wet? Can she use broken crockery instead of river stone? Della answered each one. Clay should be an inch minimum. Thicker was better, but the pipe needed to breathe, so do not seal it completely against the stones. Wet stones could crack, or worse, the moisture could turn to steam inside a sealed space and blow the clay packing apart. Broken crockery worked but was lighter than stone, so more of it was needed to match the heat capacity. Teaching suited Della in ways she had not expected. She was not a patient person by nature. 29 years of moving through a world that did not slow down for women had burned most of the patience out of her. But standing in her cabin with a candle and a strip of smoke cloth, watching someone's face shift from confusion to understanding, she found a patience she did not know she had. It came from the same place the tank idea had come from. Her father's hands on a brick wall, his voice calm, explaining heat to a 9-year-old who did not yet know she would need it. Rusk did not come to Sunday teaching. Rusk did not come to Della's cabin at all. What Rusk did was wait. He waited through the first week of people visiting. He waited through the second week of Haugen stacking stones around his stove and Espelon building her mud bench. He waited through the Sunday teaching sessions and the slow transformation of Della Rowley from failed widow to the person you asked about winter. And while he waited, he calculated. Rusk sold stoves, cheap sheet iron stoves that heated fast and cooled fast and needed feeding every 2 hours through the night. Every stove sale came with a coal delivery contract, and every coal contract came with a markup that Russ considered reasonable and his customers considered unavoidable. The stove business was not just hardware, it was dependency. A family that bought a Rusk stove bought a Rusk winter, and Rusk's winters were profitable. Della's tank threatened that economy, not because every family would build a heat bank, most could not, but because the principle behind it reduced fuel consumption, and reduced consumption meant reduced coal purchases, and reduced coal purchases meant Rusk's freight wagon ran fewer loads at thinner margins. His first move was legal. He sent Abel Marr, the same county clerk's assistant who had delivered Emmett's death notice, to Della's cabin with a letter claiming that the locomotive tank was railroad property removed without authorization, and that Rusk, as the railroad's local freight agent, had standing to reclaim it. Della produced the receipt. Abel read it, turned it over, held it up to the window light as if checking for forgery, and then folded it and put it in his pocket. "Looks proper to me," he said. He had the particular tiredness of a man who carried other people's conflicts for a living and would have preferred to carry mail. Rusk's second move was economic. He dropped the price of his cheapest stove by $2 and told families that a good stove was safer than a widow's experiment. He did not say the experiment was dangerous. He said it was unproven. The difference was subtle and effective. Unproven meant that any failure could be blamed on the design rather than on the builder, and that meant liability, and liability meant fear. But the Black Frost had already answered the question. 9 people alive in a cabin with a dead fire was not unproven. It was proof, and proof traveled faster than pricing. Sure, Vangen did not recover the way a younger body recovers. The storm walk had cost him something that rest and warmth could not repay. His lungs, already scarred from decades of lime kiln dust and lake wind, now rattled with every deep breath. He coughed in the mornings, not Nettie's wet cough of illness, but a dry, persistent rasp that sounded like sand moving through a pipe. He tired faster. He stood slower. His hands, which had threaded rope through sheaves and crimped pipe joints with the precision of a watchmaker, now trembled when he held them still. He came to Della's cabin every day for the first 2 weeks after the storm. He sat near the tank, not for warmth, though warmth helped, but because the tank was the physical product of work they had done together, and sitting near it was as close to satisfaction as Shure seemed able to come. They rebuilt the system together. The creosote joint that had wept during the storm was cut out and replaced with a new pipe section that Della bought from Orson, the first time Orson had sold her anything without a warning attached. The chimney was extended another 4 feet, bringing the total height to 18 feet above the roofline. The bypass damper was remounted with heavier hinges that would not ice shut. The clean-out plate was refitted with a gasket of woven asbestos cloth that Shure cut from an old ship's packing, the kind of material that a sailor kept for emergencies and gave away only to people he trusted with fire. During the rebuilding, Shure talked. Not about the tank, about kilns. He had spent 12 years in a Wisconsin lime kiln operation, burning limestone into quickite for plaster and cement. The work was brutal. 100-hour burns in stone towers, 40 feet tall, temperatures inside the kiln reaching over 1,000 degrees, the air thick with calcium dust that coated the lungs like paint. But the kilns taught him something about heat that the lake had not. A kiln does not care about flame, Shure said. He was sitting on Della's floor with a pipe fitting in his lap, working the threads with a file. His hand shook, but the file found the groove anyway. Flame is one moment. The kiln cares about mass. You heat the stone walls for 8 hours, and the walls heat the limestone for 20. The fire does the lighting. The stone does the cooking. That is what my father said about the iron furnace walls, Della said. She was sealing the new chimney joint with stove cement, working the gray paste into the seam with her thumb. Heat hides in weight. Your father was right. Heat is lazy. It does not want to move. Put it in something heavy and it sits there until the heavy thing forces it out. The heavier the thing, the longer it sits. He held up the pipe fitting. This is what you built. You gave the heat a place to be lazy. Every cabin in this settlement lets heat escape through the chimney because nobody gives it a reason to stay. They disagreed once, and the disagreement taught Della something Shure had not intended to teach. She wanted to pack the tank tighter, add more sand, fill every possible air gap, maximize the mass inside the shell. Shure stopped her. You are trapping heat, he said. But heat must also move. If you pack the mass so tight that air cannot circulate between the stones, the outer layer absorbs everything and the inner layer stays cold. You need gaps, small ones, enough for convection to carry warmth inward. But gaps let heat escape faster through the shell. Yes, and that is the balance. If the heat cannot get in, storing it does not matter. If the heat gets out too fast, storing it does not matter. You find the middle. The middle is where the machine works. Della stood with a bucket of sand in her hands and felt the lesson land in a place deeper than the tank. The middle, not maximum, not minimum. The place where competing needs met and neither won completely. She had been living in that place since Emmett died, between leaving and staying, between risk and safety, between Lenora's caution and her own need. The middle was not comfortable. It was just where things worked. Shure's health declined through February. The cough deepened. The tremors spread from his hands to his voice. He came to the cabin less often, and when he came, he sat instead of standing, watched instead of working. Della brought him broth and coal crumbs for his dugout stove, and he accepted both without comment, which told her more than any words about how badly the storm had broken him. In early March, Shure told Della he was leaving. His brother's widow in Kearney had room. The train fare was $7. He could not winter in a dugout again. His lungs would not survive another cold season underground. They sat in the cabin on his last evening. The tank radiated. Nettie was asleep. The wind was calm for the first time in weeks, and the silence had the particular quality of a room that knows it is about to lose someone. Shure reached into his coat and took out a knife. It was not new. The blade was 4 inches long, curved at the tip, with a handle wrapped in tarred cord. A rigging knife, the kind a sailor used to cut rope, splice line, and pry fittings loose. The blade was worn thin from years of use, the edge honed down past the original bevel. "You do not need my hands now," Shure said. He put the knife on the table. "You know where force hides." Della picked up the knife. It weighed almost nothing. The handle was warm from his coat. She turned it over and saw the marks on the blade, small nicks and scratches from rope and iron and wood, a history of work written in metal. She hung the knife on a nail beside the stove. Shure watched her do it and nodded once, and that was the last time he sat in her cabin. The stillness after he left had weight. Della could feel it in the room the way she could feel the tank's radiant heat, not as absence, but as presence, the presence of a thing that had changed shape. She had arrived in this cabin alone, with a dead husband's debts and a sick child and a stove that glowed at the seams. A stranger had walked down a rail-cut grade because he saw her reset a failed rig, and now she knew things about force and heat and patience that she had not known before, and the stranger was gone, and the knowing remained. She checked the candle. The draft pulled steady. She banked the fire and lay down beside Nettie and listened to the tank tick its slow, metallic count of heat, leaving iron and entering air, and she did not sleep for a long time. The schoolhouse crisis came in November, 9 months after the Black Frost, and 2 weeks after the first hard freeze of the new winter. The Dry Creek Schoolhouse was a single-room frame building at the crossroads, built the previous spring by subscription. 32 children attended when the weather allowed. The heating system was a large box stove donated by Rusk, a bigger version of the cheap sheet iron models he sold to homesteaders, installed with a chimney run of 10 feet and a brick pad under the firebox. It heated fast, cooled fast, and burned through a quarter cord of wood per school week. On a Tuesday afternoon, the chimney cracked. The freeze had come suddenly. Not Black Frost sudden, but fast enough that the chimney's clay-mortared brick joints had expanded and contracted unevenly, opening a crack in the middle section that vented smoke into the attic space. The teacher smelled it first. Then the children smelled it. Within 10 minutes, the room was hazy, and the stove had to be extinguished. 30 children were sent to Rusk's freight shed, which had a larger stove and more space. But Rusk's shed stove smoked badly in north wind. The chimney was short, the building was drafty, and the stove had been installed for warming freight handlers, not housing children. By the second day, 3 children were coughing. By the third, the school board met in Orson Bell's hardware store to decide what to do. Della arrived uninvited. She had heard about the chimney from Lenora, who had 2 children in the school. She walked to the hardware store with her coat buttoned to the throat and her hands in her pockets and the rigging knife on her belt. Not because she needed a knife, but because carrying it felt like carrying Shure's permission to speak in rooms where men made decisions. The school board consisted of Orson, Rusk, a farmer named Aldrich Tveet who served as trustee, and the teacher, a young woman named Clara Stensland, who had been in the territory less than a year and was still learning which men to listen to and which to endure. "The chimney needs rebuilding," Orson said. "That is a spring job. Brick, mortar, a mason. We cannot do it before the ground thaws." "Then we use Rusk's shed until spring," Aldrich said. Rusk's shed is making children sick, Clara said. She said it quietly, the way a young woman said things in a room full of older men, but she said it. Della spoke from the doorway. I can build a temporary heat bench in the schoolhouse. Stovepipe through packed stone and clay along the south wall, with a clean-out and a new chimney run outside the cracked section. It will not fix the chimney. It will make the stove's heat last longer and keep the smoke path clear while the cracked section is sealed from outside. The room went quiet. Rusk leaned forward. You want to run an experiment on 30 children. It is not an experiment. I have been running it in my cabin since December. Orson has inspected it twice. Lenora Pike has a version in her own house. Rolf Haugen has stones around his stove. Marta Espeland has a mud bench. The principle works. The question is whether this room will let me build one before another child gets sick in your shed. She looked at Rusk when she said your shed. Rusk looked at Orson. Orson looked at the floor. I will back it, Orson said. He did not say it with enthusiasm. He said it with the resigned precision of a man who had inspected the evidence and could not argue with it. I will inspect every joint before a child sits in that room. If the draft is wrong by a hair, we shut it down. And if the draft is right, Clara asked, then 30 children will be warm, and I will have been wrong twice in 1 year, which is 2 more times than I prefer. Rusk said nothing. He folded his arms and watched Della the way a man watches a fire that has gotten closer to his fence line than he is comfortable with. Della built the heat bench in 4 days, without Shure. This was the test she had not known was coming, not the test of the design, which she trusted, but the test of whether she could do it alone. Shure's hands were in Kearney. Shure's knowledge was in her own hands, and the distance between those two facts was the distance she had to cross. Lenora organized the mothers. They carried stones from the creek bed, flat, heavy, scrubbed clean, the same kind Della had used in the tank. They mixed clay and ash and sand. They held pipe sections while Della crimped joints. They did not know what they were building, not exactly, but they trusted the woman who had kept 9 people alive on a dead fire, and trust was enough to make them carry rocks in November. The bench ran 12 feet along the south wall. It was 3 feet wide and 18 inches tall, a rectangular frame of scrap lumber packed with stones and clay, with 6-inch stovepipe running through the center in a single horizontal pass before turning up through a new chimney thimble cut into the wall. The external chimney was rebuilt around the cracked section using salvaged brick, new mortar, and a taller run that Orson specified. A clean-out barrel, a short section of wide pipe with a removable cap, sat at the low end of the bench for soot removal. If this story reminds you why practical knowledge matters more than any amount of money, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what Della builds next protects more than her own family. Della applied every lesson Shure had taught her. The stones were heated before packing to drive out moisture. The clay was mixed thick enough to seal, but thin enough to let heat penetrate. The air gaps between stones were deliberate. Small channels that allowed convection to carry warmth inward, the balance Shure had insisted on. The clean-out was accessible. The bypass was functional. The chimney drew clean. Orson inspected every joint. He crawled under the bench with a candle and checked for smoke leaks. He tapped the chimney from outside and listened. He watched the draft candle for 20 minutes while the wind shifted through 3 directions. It draws, he said. He did not smile. He marked the chimney height on his ledger and wrote beside it, Rowley bench design, 14-foot draw, south wall mount, clean out at west end. On the 5th day, 30 children sat in the schoolhouse. The stove burned cottonwood. The exhaust traveled through the bench. The stones drank heat. By afternoon, the stove was banked and the bench was warm enough to sit on, and children lined up along the south wall with their backs against the clay-packed stones and their readers in their laps. And the room was warm, and the air was clean, and Clara Stensland looked at Della through the window and mouthed two words: "Thank you." Rusk watched from across the road. He did not enter the schoolhouse. He did not inspect the bench. He stood outside his freight shed with his arms folded and his jaw set, and anyone who looked at him could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man whose inventory had just been made less necessary by a woman with a rigging knife and a pile of rocks. That evening, Della walked home alone. The sun was low and red, and the prairie grass was stiff with frost, and the schoolhouse chimney sent a thin line of smoke straight up into still air. She carried the rigging knife on her belt and the memory of 30 children pressing their backs against warm stone, and she thought about Sjur in Kearney, breathing in a heated room with his brother's widow, his hands finally still. She had built the bench without him. She had measured and crimped and sealed and tested, without his voice telling her where the angle was wrong. The knowledge was hers now, not borrowed, not supervised, not dependent on a man standing at the anchor point. Hers, earned through rope and iron and split palms and 22 days of hauling dead weight across frozen ground. The tank waited at home, ticking its slow metallic rhythm. Nettie waited too, healthier now, growing into the kind of child who watched her mother's hands, the way Della had once watched her father's. The cabin was warm, the claim was safe, and the winter, which had once been an equation with no solution, was now a problem she knew how to answer. But Rusk was still calculating, and men who calculated in silence were more dangerous than men who laughed out loud. Rusk's cheap copies appeared before Christmas. He called them improved stove benches and sold them through his freight shed for $3 each. A kit of thin sheet iron pipe, a bag of sand, and a printed instruction card that showed a pipe running through a wooden box packed with gravel. No clean out, no bypass damper, no mention of chimney height or draft testing, no mention of creosote. The instruction card said, "Install in 2 hours," and showed a drawing of a smiling family sitting beside a bench that radiated neat lines of warmth like a picture in a catalog. The first kit went to a bachelor named Parnell Grindheim, who farmed 40 acres east of the creek and had spent the black frost burning his kitchen chair to keep his cabin above freezing. Parnell installed the bench in an afternoon, exactly as the instruction card described. He ran the pipe through a wooden box, packed it with dry gravel, and connected it to his existing chimney, which was 9 feet tall, 4 feet shorter than Della's minimum. The bench worked for 6 days. On the 7th, the gravel shifted inside the box and pressed against the pipe at a bend, creating a restriction that slowed the exhaust. Creosote built behind the restriction. The draft weakened. Smoke began seeping through the gravel and out through gaps in the wooden frame. Parnell woke at 2 a.m. to a cabin full of haze and a headache that felt like an axe behind his eyes. He stumbled outside, vomited in the snow, and spent the rest of the night in his barn wrapped in horse blankets while the smoke cleared. Della heard about it from Lenora the next afternoon. She walked to Parnell's cabin and found the bench still assembled, still leaking smoke from 3 places where the gravel had packed tight against the pipe. She pulled the pipe out, scraped it clean. The creosote came out in a black rope as thick as her thumb, and showed Parnell where the restriction had formed. "Who sold you this?" she asked, though she already knew. "Rusk. $3 for the kit. Said it was your design, improved." "My design has a clean out. This does not. My design has a bypass damper. This does not. My design requires a 14-foot chimney. Yours is 9. And my design does not use a wooden box, because wood burns and a pipe full of hot exhaust sitting in a box of dry gravel against dry wood is not a bench. It is a slow fire. She dismantled the bench and rebuilt it properly, stone instead of gravel, clay packing instead of a wooden frame, a clean out at the low end, and 4 additional feet of chimney pipe that cost Parnell $1.50 from Orson's hardware stock. The rebuild took 2 days. When she was done, she taped the instruction card from Rusk's kit to Parnell's wall and wrote across it in charcoal, "No clean out, no damper, no safety. Ask Della." The confrontation with Rusk happened the following Saturday in his freight shed, in front of 8 men and 3 women who had come for mail. Della walked in carrying the black creosote rope she had pulled from Parnell's pipe. She laid it on Rusk's counter like a dead snake. It was 22 inches long and stiff with hardened tar. "You copied the shape and left out the sense," she said. Rusk looked at the creosote rope and then looked at the people watching. His face went through several expressions: annoyance, calculation, the particular tightness of a man caught between defending a product and admitting a problem. "I sold a stove bench," Rusk said. "People asked for something like yours. I provided it at a price they could afford. You provided a pipe in a box with no way to clean it and no way to check it. Parnell Grindheim nearly died of smoke in his sleep. If he had not woken up, you would be explaining to the county why your $3 kit killed a man." "Grindheim installed it wrong." "Grindheim installed it exactly as your card described. I have the card. Do you want me to read it aloud?" Rusk did not want her to read it aloud. The people in the shed were watching with the particular attention of an audience that understood they were witnessing something that would be retold. Rusk sold things to these people. Their trust was his inventory, and it was shrinking. "I will revise the instructions," Rusk said. "You will add a clean out, a bypass damper, and a chimney height requirement, or you will stop selling them." Della picked up the creosote rope and held it where everyone could see. "This is what happens inside a pipe that cannot be cleaned. This is not a stove bench. This is 22 inches of poison waiting for someone to go to sleep." She left the creosote rope on the counter and walked out. Behind her, the shed was quiet. Rusk stood with the black rope in front of him and the instruction card stacked on the shelf behind him, and the knowledge that Della Rowley had just made his product dangerous in the minds of every person who had witnessed the exchange. He did not revise the instructions. He stopped selling the kits. The remaining stock sat on a shelf in his shed for months, unsold, until he eventually broke them apart for the pipe sections and sold those separately. It was not a grand defeat. It was the slow, practical humiliation of a man whose shortcut had been held up to the light and found to be exactly what it was. Rusk's final reckoning came in February, during another hard freeze, not as severe as the Black Frost, but cold enough to test every chimney and stove in the settlement. His own freight office heater was a large box stove connected to a stovepipe run that passed through a crude stone box he had built behind the shed wall. It was his version of Della's design, built from observation, not instruction. He had watched the schoolhouse bench from across the road. He had seen the pipe angle, the stone packing, the chimney height. He had replicated it with the confidence of a man who believed that seeing was understanding. He had not built a clean out. The pipe clogged on a Tuesday night. Creosote built behind a restriction where the pipe entered the stone box at too sharp an angle. The same mistake Parnell had made, the same mistake Della had warned about on Sundays, the same mistake that existed because Rusk had copied the visible parts of the design and ignored the invisible ones. The draft died. Smoke reversed. By Wednesday morning, the freight shed was thick with haze, and Rusk's morning customers walked into a wall of acrid air that drove them back onto the road. Rusk opened the doors and tried to clear the smoke by brute ventilation, but the cold poured in, and the stove could not overcome both the blocked pipe and the open doors. He was trapped between smoke and cold, and neither would negotiate. Orson Bell arrived because customers came to his hardware store complaining that Rusk's shed smelled like a burning tar pit. Orson walked into the shed, looked at the stone box, and said, "Where is the clean-out?" Rusk said nothing. "Open the pipe," Orson said. They disconnected the pipe from the stone box and tilted it. Soot and creosote fell out in a solid black rope, longer than the one Della had pulled from Parnell's bench, thicker, compressed by weeks of accumulation. It hit the floor with a wet, heavy sound, and the men standing in the doorway looked at it the way people look at evidence they had hoped would not exist. Orson turned to Rusk. "You sold kits without cleanouts. You told Della she was running an experiment, and you built the same thing yourself without the part that keeps it from killing you." Rusk stared at the soot rope on his floor. His face held the particular expression of a man who had been building a story about himself for years. The practical businessman, the provider, the man who knew how things worked, and had just watched that story come apart in a black pile of creosote. "I sold the shortcut," Rusk said. His voice was flat. "She taught the method." It was the closest thing to an admission Cassian Rusk would ever make. He did not apologize. He did not come to Sunday teaching. He did not acknowledge Della on the road. But he stopped selling stove kits, and he stopped hinting that her claim improvements would be his when she failed, and he stopped sending boys to check her salvage rights. The silence was not friendship. It was the particular quiet that follows a contest when one side has run out of arguments. Reuben Vale arrived in Dry Creek in the spring of 1889, hired by the school board to repair the schoolhouse floor where Della's emergency heat bench had been installed and removed during the chimney rebuilding. He was 43, widowed, a carpenter from Kearney who had lost his wife to typhoid 2 years earlier, and his shop to the debt that followed. He came with a tool chest, a clean shirt, and the careful manners of a man who had learned that starting over required being noticed for the right reasons. Della met him on the day he began pulling the damaged floorboards. She had come to check the new permanent heat bench that Orson had installed during the chimney rebuild. A proper version, with brick walls, a clean-out, and a bypass damper built to Della's specifications by a mason Orson hired from Broken Bow. She wanted to inspect the clean-out gasket and make sure the new chimney mortar had set properly. Reuben was on his knees with a pry bar when she walked in. He looked up, saw the rigging knife on her belt, and said, "You're the woman who built the iron bank." "I am the woman who checks the clean-out," Della said. "The bank was a group effort." He watched her work. She removed the clean-out cap, peered inside with a candle, scraped a thin layer of soot from the pipe wall, replaced the cap, and tightened the bolts. She checked the bypass damper. The hinge moved freely, the plate seated flush. She held the candle at the entry collar and watched the flame bend toward the chimney. "You measure before you look," Reuben said. "Looking tells you what you hope. Measuring tells you what you have." He nodded. It was the nod of a man who built things for a living and recognized the philosophy in another builder. He did not compliment her. He did not ask how a woman had learned to check draft. He went back to pulling floorboards, and when he needed a measurement confirmed, he asked Della instead of his own tape, and she gave it without looking up from the clean-out. They worked in the schoolhouse for 3 days. The conversation happened in the margins, between measurements, between boards, between the sounds of hammer and pry bar. Reuben asked about the pipe slope. Della explained the minimum angle for proper draft, a 1/4 inch of rise per foot of horizontal run, enough to keep condensation moving toward the clean-out instead of pooling at low points. Reuben asked about the brick walls of the bench. Della explained thermal mass, heat capacity, the the difference between stone and brick and iron. Reuben listened the way Schur had listened to wind, not passively, but with the active attention of a man filing information into categories he already understood. On the fourth day, he brought a question that was not about pipe slope. "The schoolhouse bench is permanent," he said, "but most cabins here have wooden walls. A stone and clay bench against a wooden wall is a risk." "That is why I teach the heat shield," Della said. "A layer of brick or stone between the bench and the wall with an air gap. The gap lets convection carry heat into the room instead of into the wood." "What if the heat shield was built into the wall itself? A double wall, outer boards, inner brick, air gap between. The wall becomes the bench." Della stopped working. She looked at Reuben, and for the first time in months she felt the particular electricity of an idea that had not occurred to her, the same jolt she had felt at the rail cut, touching the warm iron. Not her idea, his, but built on her principle, extended by a carpenter's understanding of how walls worked. "That would require rebuilding every cabin wall," she said. "Not every wall. One wall, the north wall, the one that leaks worst." They argued about it for an hour. Della said the brick would add too much weight for most cabin frames. Reuben said he could sister the studs. Della said the air gap would need to be wide enough for convection, but narrow enough to prevent drafts. Reuben said 3 inches based on work he had done insulating an ice house in Kearney. Della said an ice house kept cold in, not heat. Reuben said the physics were the same. Mass and air gaps worked in both directions. The argument ended without resolution, which was the mark of a good argument. Both of them went home with something to think about, and both of them came back the next day with modifications to the other's objections. Courtship, for people who had already buried a spouse and rebuilt a life from the foundation up, did not look like courtship. It looked like work. Reuben moved a workbench into Della's shed before he moved into her house. He built a prototype double wall in the shed, tested it with a stove and a thermometer, and brought Della the results like a man presenting evidence in court. The north wall of the shed held heat 6 hours longer than the south wall. The air gap worked. They married in the fall of 1889. The ceremony was brief. A circuit preacher, Lenora as witness, Nettie holding a bundle of dried grass because flowers were done for the year. Reuben moved his tool chest into the cabin and built a shelf for it beside the tank, and the rigging knife and the carpenter's square hung on adjacent nails, and the cabin that had been built for one family now held the tools of 2 trades and the particular orderly density of a household where both people knew how to measure. By the early 1890s, Della kept a ledger. The ledger was a plain composition book, purchased for 15 cents from a drummer passing through on the Burlington line. In it, she recorded every heat bank, bench, extended flue, and stone-packed chimney run she had helped build, inspected, or advised on in the Dry Creek settlement and the surrounding homesteads. 37 cabins, 2 schoolhouses, 1 church. Each entry included the owner's name, the date of installation, the chimney height, the type of mass, stone, brick, clay, sand, iron, or some combination, the pipe diameter, and the clean-out schedule. Beside each entry, in smaller handwriting, she noted the problems: a clean-out gasket that needed replacing, a chimney that drew weakly in south wind, a bench where the clay had cracked and needed resealing. She refused to patent anything. Reuben raised it once, carefully, the way a husband raises a subject he knows will not be received well. "A patent would give you credit," he said, "and income. The design is yours." "The design is physics," Della said. "My father did not patent brick walls. Schur did not patent pulleys. You do not patent the air gap. These are things that exist. I showed people where to find them. A patent does not warm a neighbor who cannot pay a licensing fee." Reuben did not raise it again. He understood that Della's refusal was not modesty, it was philosophy. The knowledge had come to her through a chain of hands, her father's palm on a kiln wall, Shear's rope through a sheave, her own fingers on the iron at the rail cut, and she could not own what had been given. She could only pass it forward, the way heat passed through mass, slowly, steadily, without asking permission. The teaching continued on Sundays. The students changed. Early on, they were homesteaders looking for survival, men and women who had spent the black frost feeding fires all night and wanted a better answer. Later, they were builders, people who had already installed a bench or a stone ring and wanted to understand why it worked, not just how. Della taught both groups the same way, with a candle, a strip of smoke cloth, and the clean-out plate. She taught Orson Bell how to inspect a heat bench. He added it to his services. For a small fee, he would examine a bench installation and certify it safe. Della approved of this. A man who charged for inspections would inspect carefully, and careful inspections kept people alive. She taught Lenora Pike how to teach. Lenora, who had begun as a skeptic and become a student and then a friend, learned the candle test and the smoke cloth test and the tap and listen method for checking pipe integrity. When Della was busy with Reuben, with Nettie, with the growing demands of a homestead that now fed 3 people instead of 2, Lenora taught in her place. The lessons were the same. The voice was different. The principle traveled. She taught Nettie everything, not on Sundays, every day. Nettie grew from the thin, coughing 8-year-old who had watched the tank arrive to a sharp, quiet girl who could check a clean out by touch and read a draft candle at a glance. She inherited her mother's hands, practical, scarred, competent, and her grandfather's understanding of heat, though she had never met him. She filed the knowledge the way Della had once filed her father's lesson, without knowing yet what it would become. When Nettie turned 13, she asked to be the one who checked the schoolhouse bench. Della said yes. When Nettie turned 15, she told Clara Stensland that she wanted to teach. Clara, who by then had spent 6 winters in the territory and understood that survival knowledge was as important as reading, gave Nettie a corner of the schoolroom and 30 minutes every Friday. Nettie taught clean-out maintenance to children who had never known a winter without a heat bench. They listened the way children listen to anything an older girl says with conviction, half bored, half fascinated, entirely unaware that they were learning something that might one day save their lives. Tjurvangen died in the winter of 1891. Della learned about it from a letter carried on the Burlington line, a single page, written in a woman's careful hand, telling her that Sjur had passed in his sleep during a cold night in December. His lungs had finally closed. He had been comfortable. He had not been alone. The letter mentioned that Sjur had spoken of a woman in Dry Creek who understood kilns, and that he had asked to be remembered to her. Della read the letter at the kitchen table while the tank ticked beside her. She folded it and put it in the composition book between the entry for cabin number 23 at Aldrich Tvite's north wall bench and cabin number 24 backer, a widow named Birgit Lund, who had built a stone ring around her stove using instructions Lenora had given her. She did not cry. She hung the rigging knife back on its nail. It had migrated to Reuben's workbench for a week while he used it to cut cord, and she looked at the blade, worn thin from rope and clay and winter, and she let the silence in the cabin hold the weight of what had been lost. A man had walked 2 miles through a killing storm because he wanted to see whether a thing they built together would hold. It held. He had paid for the walk with his lungs and eventually his life. The iron was still warm. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the work continues. Reuben built double walls in 9 cabins over 2 winters. The design worked. The air gap kept heat in and cold out, and the inner brick absorbed stove heat during the day and released it through the night. He and Della argued about dimensions, materials, and methods with the particular energy of two people who respected each other's competence enough to disagree loudly and concede quietly. Della's claim received final proof in 1890, 160 acres, free and clear, under her name alone. She stood in the county office while Abel Marr, still carrying other people's documents with the same tired patience, stamped the certificate and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Rowley, or is it Mrs. Vale now?" "It is Della," she said, "and the claim was always mine. Reuben died in 1903. A fall from a schoolhouse roof he was re-shingling, the same schoolhouse Della had saved with a heat bench 15 years earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Della, who sat beside his bed for 2 days while his body decided whether the fall would kill him. It did. She buried him beside Emmett on the claim near the fence line. 2 husbands in the same ground, both taken by work that should not have killed them. She did not leave. The claim held her the way the tank held heat, through weight and habit and the accumulated mass of a life built in one place. Nettie kept the ledger. The composition book filled and was replaced by a second, then a third. Della aged into the authority figure she had once faced across her own cabin. The person who walked in, checked the clean-out, tapped the chimney, and told you whether your winter would be survivable. But unlike Orson, who had arrived with verdicts, Della arrived with questions. The first thing she asked any homesteader was not, "What do you have?" but, "What can you build with what you have?" The difference mattered. Orson had measured Della against a standard she could not meet. Della measured people against what was possible, and then helped them reach it. She died in 1911, in the same cabin, on a cold night in November. Nettie was with her. The tank was still on its plinth, repaired, resealed, maintained for 23 years. The iron shell worn thin in places, but still holding its shape. The last thing Della asked before she slept was whether the schoolhouse cleanout had been swept before the first snow. Nettie said it had. Della nodded and closed her eyes, and the tank ticked beside her the way it had ticked every night since she hauled it 7 miles on cottonwood rollers and rope. By the time Dry Creek stopped calling the storm the Black Frost and started calling it the Boiler Winter, Della's method had changed how the settlement survived cold. Not every cabin had a tank. Most never would. But dozens had stones around the stove, longer flues routed through clay-packed benches, cleaner chimneys with accessible cleanouts, and the habit, quiet, practical, passed from hand to hand of storing heat in weight instead of trusting flame alone. 37 cabins, 2 schoolhouses, and 1 church carried some form of what a woman with split palms and a dead husband's debts had built from scrap iron in her father's memory. Della Rowley lived and died on the same 160 acres she had nearly lost. She never patented anything. She never charged for teaching. She never left Custer County after arriving with a broken wedge handle and $29. Reuben built her a proper door with iron hinges to replace the leather ones, and that door opened and closed 10,000 times over 20 years. And behind it, the tank sat on its plinth and radiated, and the rigging knife hung on its nail, the blade worn to a sliver. Sleet hardened black on the grass outside Rusk's freight shed. Men laughed and shook their heads and called her a sparrow dragging a plow. The iron cylinder sat in the mud at the rail cut, 400 pounds of dead weight that no one wanted and no one could move and no one understood. Cassian Rusk leaned against his door frame and smiled the way a man smiles when the world is working the way he expects it to work. But years later, In a schoolhouse at the crossroads, children pressed their backs against a clay heat bench and felt the warmth come through the stone. And above the stove where the fire had gone to coals, Della's old rigging knife hung from a nail, its blade worn thin from rope, clay, and winter. The sparrow did not drag the plow. She learned where the weight was hiding and made the whole valley pull with her.